This is really tough in Washington, D.C. to come to a learned audience and talk about policy during the silly season, right before an election, when discussions about policy and rational thought are hard to find anywhere, at least around Washington, D.C. So it's going to be a little bit difficult as we talk about the overlap, the multidisciplinary sharing between science and art, and I'm going to try and add on top of that policy, or the role of policy in an interface with science and art. And of course, the policy guys will tell you that there's a real science to what we do in developing policy here in Washington, D.C. Those who are a part of it will tell you that there is nothing related to or even remotely reflective of policy, repeatable process, or science in what goes on here in Washington, D.C. And that in fact, as policymakers like to say, it's like making sausage. Well, the truth is that the best policy that Washington, D.C. produces rarely looks as good as sausage and never functions as well. When that fails, we like to say that it's an art. Developing policy here in Washington, D.C. is about putting together things that inspire people to do well in our country. And in truth, policymakers very seldom produce things that inspire people or that look pretty. When policy is done right, at the very best, it mitigates the bad and helps influence and make possible the good. In our society, that often means the good that can come out of the development of science and technology, and that's what I'm going to focus an awful lot on today, how science and technology is driving change in our society, change that our policymakers are having to deal with in ever-increasing ways, at ever-increasing frequency, and how our policymakers are missing the tools that we need to help them acquire to be able to deal with these issues, how art is a piece of that, how science can help make that happen, and how because the latest revolution that science and technology is giving us, the revolution of neurotechnology, is both going to make it imminent and entirely necessary that we embark upon this interface between the scientist, the artist, and the policymaker if we're to survive what we're creating. So I'm from the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and that's what we do, science and technology policy. It's I saw a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon this last weekend that really brought home this whole thing. It's a little kid standing at a roadside lemonade stand selling swift kicks in the butt for $5. And he's commenting to the guy who pulls up there, nobody wants to buy what I have to sell, even though everybody needs it. That's what science and technology policy is all about here in Washington, D.C. We like to think that someday we can convince our policymakers that the policy and the laws, the legislation that they put in place is inspired and enhanced and informed by science, by good, rational analysis of what the outcomes might be and what our options are for dealing with it. Very hard to do and very hard to accomplish, and not at all what I'm going to talk about today. In fact, I'm going to talk about the other side of science and technology policy, and that is the side where we're creating the science. You're creating the science. That turns into technology that profoundly changes the way we live, the way we interact, our society. And all of those changes that are inspired and brought about by the science and technology that you're doing here means that we have to change the way we live together, the way we govern each other. Science and technology policy in this context is the need to develop policy, legal structure to deal with and help us handle, utilize for the best of our society the technology that we're developing, and most often limit the negative effects of the technology that we're building. So although it's really important to help talk our policymakers into developing policy using science to develop policy, I'm going to talk today about how science and technology is forcing the policymaker to have to learn about what you do. We do a lot of this, as I say, at the Potomac Institute. This is a little commercial part here. It's part of the cost of letting me come here. We're a not-for-profit. We come from the U.S. Congress, although now we're an independent science and technology policy think tank in the Washington, D.C. area. And an awful lot of what we do is produce trends on what's happening in science and technology and what are the impacts of that science and technology on our national security and our society. So we write lots of books and give lots of briefings, and on good days, we keep the audience awake for 3 or 4 minutes during the first 2 or 3 slides before the policymakers go off to the next briefing. Changes and what this is all about. This is meant to be a messy chart, and it's a really, really messy chart. And the message here is that every time we as human beings figure out a new way to do something, develop a new tool, we profoundly change the way our society operates. And it is tools, as Jim Giordano mentioned earlier. The development of tools allows us the ability to go do science that creates new tools. But every time we develop a new tool, we improve the way we live, we improve the way we do things, and the fact that we're able to print a book or develop an automobile doesn't just allow us to transport things across the country or the world better. It changes the way we live in ways that require us to develop policy and law for dealing with it. Automobiles are really cool things, and they really allow us to change our society. They also require us to figure out how to make sure they don't run into each other. And when they do run into each other, who's responsible? The factories and the ability to be able to produce an automobile, mass production, the Industrial Revolution that hit us around the turn of the century, was a wonderful thing that totally changed our society, allowed us to build automobiles and many, many, many other things. Those factories also brought with us the need to have worker reform, protection for the workers, all different types of regulations to make sure that those companies didn't take over the society that they were meant to serve. Almost every development of a new technology not only changes our society for the better, but it puts upon us the need to figure out how to regulate it, control it, and make sure that the good always outweighs the bad. Sometimes this is easier than other times, and usually it's not very intuitive. One of the more easy technologies to regulate was actually nuclear technology. The bad parts of nuclear technology were so evident to the whole world that most people came together and said, we really don't want that stuff to spread around and for everybody to have nuclear weapons. The bad parts of nuclear power plants coming unglued and radiating the neighborhood were so obvious and have been demonstrated enough times that people put pretty good regulations around when, how, and where you can build a nuclear power plant. The good parts of nuclear, the cheap nuclear power, have been realized in a very tight regulatory framework from the very beginning. We didn't build our first nuclear power plant before there were already laws and regulations in place. On the other hand, way down at this end, when things are happening very quickly, we're developing all kinds of technologies that are becoming real and are changing our society long before we have the ability to do anything about it. And that's what this talk is all about. And hopefully I'll be able to communicate it in a little bit more succinct fashion. It's happening fast. As those of you in the field know, science is moving at an ever-increasing rate. This is just one end of the curve. If you back it up about 100 years, you'll see that this curve is actually exponential. And this is just the US side of this. If you bring in the world, which in the last 20 years has discovered one of the United States' greatest secrets, we invest in technology, and it really empowers our economy. Guess what? In the last 20 years, the rest of the world has started to invest in technology at the same rate we are, in some cases at a greater rate than we are, and they're catching up. The end result of that in a world that is so greatly connected is lots of science is getting done. An awful lot of science is getting done. And not only is it good science, but we figured out how to turn it into products a lot faster. Back there somewhere in the 50s, I'd like to say before I was born, but you're smarter than that, it took 20 years for TVs to sell 20 million copies around the world. 20 years from the development of the capability till it was really deployed. Way on the other end over here, the iPhone 5 came out 2 weeks ago, and in the first 7 days sold 10 million copies. We're really good now at getting science into technology, into things that get into your hands. And once they hit your hand and 10 or 50 or 100 million other people's hands, there isn't or there shouldn't be any question that this really changes the way you live. It changes the way your family lives. It changes the way we interoperate. It changes the way we do business. And that in turn makes many of the laws we live under today just nonsensical anymore. And it also makes the need for new policy and legislation that much more urgent. It's happening faster and faster. So, as these disruptive things happen, the big question always comes up, well, what's the next one? What's the next big thing that's going to happen? There's 4 of them that we know of that we can identify right now happening at the same time, simultaneously today. So that crunch of things happening faster and faster has hit the point where we have at least 4 disruptive big technologies going on all at one time, and their impact is hard to judge, much less figure out how to deal with them. The digital revolution you're all a part of, we've been in the middle of it for 25 to 30 years. It has changed everything, but to remind you, there was a day when every executive had a secretary and her #1 job was to type. She spent 70% of her time typing. That doesn't happen today. There aren't secretaries. There aren't typewriter companies. It was a day when you wanted to ship things around the world to India, China. You had to build a worldwide corporation that had centers and shipping points, that had communications. You often had to own your own communications lines around the world. It took tens of thousands of people to be an international company 25 years ago, just 25 years ago. Today, it takes an internet address, a computer, a cell phone, a FedEx account, a UPS account, and a couple outsourced developers like maybe Dell or Amazon, and you know what? You're an international company. That's how the digital revolution has changed the way we operate today, and that's just the obvious stuff. And you know what? We're still struggling with how to develop policy and laws for dealing with that obvious stuff. I'll talk a little bit more about the harder stuff in just a little bit. Biorevolution. People don't, all of us have a hard time understanding how profoundly that's going to change what I'm talking about. Really good stuff. We're going to live longer. We're already living longer. I'm at an age where 20, 30 years ago, my children would be worrying about what cemetery I was buying into. Today, we worry about that of our parents because people live to be 80 or 90 or older. And the effect of that isn't just children having to take care of their parents. The effect of that is profoundly economic. People don't retire at 60 anymore. When they don't retire until they're 70, the jobs don't open up. When the jobs don't open up, you have an employment crisis as we have today. If we retired 4 million people today, there are currently about 17 million people left in the baby boom. If you all remember the baby boom from World War II, there's about 17 million people in it. If you retire 1/4 of that population, who are all about 60, 62, 63, 64, retire about 4 million of them because they're all at the high end of their career. Each one of them's salary is worth 4 entry-level people. Every single one of these old guys, geezers like me, you retire, you get 4 new jobs. You could close that unemployment statistic overnight by just retiring people. Guess what? We're not retiring. That's what the biorevolution means. On the good side, that's the good side. The negative side is 1 in a million. Statistics are that 1 in a million are a little off their rocker, and that includes people like me. Somewhere in that 1 in a million are people that go postal and go grab a gun and take out their workforce. How long is it before the technology is so available that one of those postal guys can't just grab a revolver, but he can grab the data and the information and the materials to create a virus that kills us all? This isn't nuclear, where the materials are hard to get and easy to control. This is, the information's out there on the internet and the material is here, everywhere. That's scary. Nanotech is where we're developing little microscopic machines that go reproduce themselves and hopefully do really good things. And the potential here is spectacular, and it's happening. slowly, but it's happening. You can look for, in the next couple of decades, where we can inject these little things into your body and they can go eat away the cancer, do all the things that we have to go to the gym to do today, all those hard things. Nanotech is wonderful. And of course, uncontrolled, undisciplined, unregulated nanotechnology could be the most destructive thing in the world. It's conceivable, yes, science fiction today, but conceivable that we can create nanotechnology that wouldn't just eat a pile of raw materials and create a computer, but would eat a pile of raw materials and then just keep going until it ate the house and all the people in it. So these things need to be thought about. These things need to be analyzed. These things need to have laws and regulations put around them that advocates and helps the good happen while prevents the bad from happening. This is hard. This is really hard given that most of our policymakers don't even know that these four things exist, much less what they mean. In all of this, while we're trying to deal with digital cell phones and the change in our business, along comes neurotechnology and the promise of neurotechnology that you heard Professor Giordano talk about, and you heard some tremendous artists communicate the meaning of to you. And what neurotechnology can mean, as is happening right now, is something profoundly different than all those other seminal inventions in humankind. Most of those things, almost every single one of them, was about building a new tool. A tool to get me from here to there. A tool to look at something, a tool to dig in the earth deeper, a tool to fly in the sky. Those were all about giving me tools to allow the human body to go beyond where it was before. Neurotechnology is going to change the way we use tools. It's going to change the way we interface with each other. It's going to change what it means to be a human being. Neurotechnology is such a profound technological milestone in the evolution of humankind that it probably is one of the first times that we're going to be able to mark on a calendar, this is when the human race either evolved or went extinct. This is very profound, and that's why we talk about ethical, legal, social, neuro issues today, because this is not one we can really wait till the day after. This is really, really, really important, and it's happening as we speak. So as we change the way we think, what's the role of government? Not just, we say policymakers and politicians, our government. The government is there for lots of good reasons. I know it's a political season and people say the only role of the government is to protect us, or the only role of the government is to invest in science and technology, or the only role of government is to tax you, to take money into Washington, to give to good contractors. The role of government really is to help deal with these issues that the individual can't. This is the group thing that we started to do several millennia ago that has all to do with us acting as a society instead of individuals. And as our society evolves because of this technology, the role of government, I think, to help us figure out how to deal with it. In the old days, when the technology came along and changed things such that the local fiefdom couldn't deal with it and wouldn't deal with it, well, when the technology changed it enough, there was a revolution and government changed, and it was kind of bloody and hard. Today, we think we've created a government, particularly here in the United States, that has the flexibility, the built-in ability to adapt and grow and evolve along with the technology. We've proven that it can adapt, and we've proven that it can change along with changing circumstances. The question I'm going to pose to you today is the temporal one. Can it do it fast enough? And if not, what do we have to do to change it? So, in that regard, remember the curve I had before? Well, here's a new curve. This is what our Congress has been doing for the last 20-some years. Now, most people will say they're making less laws because they're becoming more partisan and they're becoming more divided. We're statistically, and if you look at the records, there's been times in our history when we've been more partisan than we are today. Maybe that's the little valleys you see out there. So it really isn't partisanship. Most of the downward trend, I contend, has to do with the fact that the problems we're asking government to deal with are harder. They're more complex. They take a lot longer for people to understand, and they take solutions that are more complex. They take solutions that have to bring more people in and have to get more people signed up, and it's just harder to do and it takes longer. But whatever, the trend of government being able to enact policy is downward. Remember our technology trend? We're producing more. If you put some arrows on there to indicate the trends, that's technology up, that's governance down. You end up, what artists would probably tell you is pretty distinctive in any culture or language on earth. X marks the spot, we're failing. You know, there isn't any way for us to win in this scenario other than to try and fix that problem right there. So the trends have a lot to do with what we have created here in the United States and why we created it. We put together a very deliberative government on purpose. We didn't want the government to run wild and do what kings and dictators and all those other kind of people did. And we didn't want a reactionary government. We didn't want a government that said, oh, this is the new fad, let's jump on board, only to find out 10 years later we really screwed things up. Let's be very deliberative and thoughtful. This is a good thing, except when things come very fast. Today, Congress is presented with the stem cells, cloning, cyber problems, cyber crime, cyber war, cyber security, cyber doctrine. How do I deal with nanotechnology? Regulation of industries doing nano and nuclear and bio, and it goes on and on and on. And they're having a hard time dealing with it, a really hard time dealing with it. And let's remember who they are. 7 of them are scientists. 7 of them are scientists. 23 have some technical training and background. Okay? Most of them are lawyers. They speak a different language. They speak a profoundly different language than all of you speak. They speak a different language than our artists speak. They speak the language of Washington, D.C. and politics, and the translation between the dictionary that translates between science and politics and policy and art hasn't been written. So that's an awful lot of the challenge that I bring here today, is we have to figure out how to do this right. We have to figure out how to communicate. We in the science and technology world need to figure out how to communicate with our policymakers. We need to figure out how to help them understand the complexity of bio, nano, and neuro. And we need to help them understand that complexity in a way that makes clear to them the options for policy and law for dealing with it. And if we try and do that by ourselves, we will always fail. We're trained wrong. We think wrong. Scientists think in, I'm going to build the evidence, I'm going to do the analysis, I'm going to do that at great detail, and somewhere near the end, after 4 years of good research, I'm going to tell you what the answer is. Policymaker starts with, here's what I'm going to do, and then I'll spend 4 years explaining it to you. We're exactly the opposite of where we need to be. Therein is the role of the artist. And I think you saw it just before I got up to speak today. How are we scientists going to communicate to the policymaker? We're going to do it with video and with art, with things that helps them understand the complexity at a more innate and human level. Neurotechnology, I think, can help solve an awful lot of this. And in a very simple way, I would put out the story that half in humor, half in seriousness, that when neurotechnology allows us to mind meld, to link our brains, the first thing we'll do is we'll connect a scientist and a politician. And I'll take bets on which one falls dead crazy on the spot. Okay, so one or the other. But sooner or later, we're going to figure out that what we need to do is mind meld a scientist, a politician, and an artist. And when we do that, we'll take one more step towards evolving as human beings. Thank you very much.